Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 11 about public policy. It's Lesson 16, the last lesson of Unit 11, about a unipolar world. In this lesson, you'll learn about the unipolar world. You'll learn about being the world's policeman. You'll learn about isolationism, and you'll learn about the multipolar world. In previous lessons, we've learned about public policy in general and about foreign policy in particular. And we've learned that America has certain choices about how it should behave in foreign policy, whether it's going to be realist or idealist, for example. Now, those choices that America makes are important to the rest of the world because of the immense strength and reach of the United States. Here's one example of America's immense strength and reach. America's military bases, which are spread all over the world. The stars on here represent actual bases. The bigger the stars are, the more bases we have in that country. The other smaller red circles represent other smaller installations or facilities we have access to in other countries around the world, where we can move our troops in and out if necessary, even though we don't have a permanent base that we run. You can see that the United States is in actually more than half of the countries around the world in one way or another. We have an immense military presence around the globe. Here's another way that America has gigantic reach around the globe, and that is through the economy. The United States of America has had the biggest economy in the world for over 100 years. Up until just recently, China, by some measures, has passed the United States. But for over 100 years, as the biggest economy in the world, we were exerting economic influence around the planet, and continue to do so. Even if China has essentially equaled the United States in economic size, we're still one of the two biggest economies in the world by far, with our presence felt all over the globe. And that economic presence around the globe has spread American culture around the globe too. Here's just one example. The iconic American restaurant McDonald's is found in most countries around the planet. Other examples are the American film industry, showing its films all around the world for huge profits. We could go on and talk about even more examples of American culture spreading around the globe. But go just about any place on the planet and you can find American influence there. Well, these ways in which American influence is felt around the world, through the military, through the economy, through culture, have led some people to describe the way the world works as a unipolar world. Now, what does that mean? Well, a pole is something that a thing rotates around, like you have the poles on a globe. Well, if you say unipolar world, you're saying that there's one pole, one thing that the whole rest of the world rotates around. In this case, it would be describing the United States of America. Now, people in other countries don't like to hear the world described that way, but many people who study international relations for many years have described the world as this, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union. There was a bipolar world, arguably back during the height of communism. On one side, you had the Soviet Union and perhaps China working together in a sense, even though they were rivals and enemies in other ways, presenting the communist bloc. And then on the other side, you had the United States, and they were fighting for world control. Well, eventually, the United States won that Cold War. Communism basically fell apart and transformed around the planet, leaving the United States as the lone superpower. And as the lone superpower, much of what was going around on the planet revolved around the United States. So in a unipolar world, you have one state, one country, that exercises military, economic, and cultural dominance all over the planet. And the United States fits that description pretty well. Well, once you're the unipolar power on the planet, then sort of by default, you become the world's policeman. You become the one that others turn to settle disputes, keep the peace, to help them develop bigger and better things for their economy, for their people, etc. They look to you to be the ones that will help them in a pinch, whatever that may be. Well, as the world's policeman, the United States provides security and protects liberty around the globe. When someone feels their freedom threatened, they may call upon the United States. That's how the United States ended up fighting in places like Korea and in Vietnam and in Kuwait and these various places around the world where the United States has went to war. But being the world's policeman, going around and trying to protect people over the planet, is a very expensive thing to do. Here's from 2015, the military budgets, the 15 biggest military budgets of countries around the world. Look at that. The United States military budget that year was 4 times the size of its next closest country, China. The United States was spending about as much on its military as the whole rest of the world combined. So being the world's policeman is very expensive, and the American people have to bear that expense. But it doesn't seem worth it. And the reason is because in fulfilling this role, Americans feel underappreciated. Many spots in the world where American troops are housed, where they go and fight and defend, they are actually reviled and hated by the people there. They don't like having the American presence there. Now, some possible reasons are that they don't feel free to govern themselves the way they otherwise would, or maybe they feel inferior that the United States needs to be there to protect them, whatever it may be. Rather than them being glad and happy that we're there, instead they are resentful. Well, why should America spend so much money trying to keep the world safe when they don't really like us for doing it? So as a consequence, this is a job that most Americans don't really want to have anymore. We don't want to keep paying the taxes or borrowing the money necessary to keep the rest of the world safe when they, at the very least, don't even appreciate it. And we wonder really whether it's effective. We also wonder if that money might be better spent at home. But if we don't act as the world's policeman, what is the alternative then for us and for the world? One possibility is isolationism. What do I mean by isolationism? I mean it's an attitude, a new foreign policy attitude, that would just say, we're better off leaving the rest of the world alone to work out their own problems for themselves. Here we have a cartoon from the era of World War II, where you have Uncle Sam representing the United States, staying separate from the troubles in Europe. Now, the benefit of isolationism is that potentially you can avoid those problems elsewhere in the world, and you can save your resources for yourself. Those are some very attractive things. But it has a potential big problem too. When we isolate ourselves, we aren't there to deal with growing problems around the world. And those problems, without us there to watch over them, may get bigger and badder. They may harm our own interests, and eventually they may wash up on our own shores. And by that time, they're too big, too bad for us to deal with as effectively as we could have if we'd sort of nipped them in the bud. In other words, if we had still been there around the world to notice them and take care of them before they became big. Instead, we're going to have to face them eventually, after they've had plenty of time to grow and become much more menacing. This is the kind of worry that we would have in a world where we are threatened in the United States by radical Islamic terrorism, for example. Well, what if the terrorists are left alone to get control of entire countries and get the budgets of those countries behind them? And they don't just become isolated terrorists, but they have become armies of terrorists. And we just kind of ignore them doing our own thing until they're showing up at our shores attacking us. That's the worry of some people when they think about the isolationism. So if isolationism isn't the solution, maybe a different solution, instead of withdrawing from the world, is to share power with others around the world, to happily see the world become a multipolar world, where there are multiple countries that who have a great deal of influence over the economy and culture and military of the planet. Well, okay, so let's say that that's our solution. We're tired of being the world's policeman. We're tired of being the world's only superpower. We're tired of having a unipolar world where we're responsible for everything and then we get all the blame for things too. So we want other people to step in and help run the world. Well, who's it going to be? Russia? Do we want to share power with Russia, or maybe even turn power over to Russia? They can be the policemen. We'll go do our own thing. The problem with that is we feel like Russia, or at least the leaders of Russia, don't share the same kind of values that we do. We view them as authoritarian. They'd be happy to create a dictatorship if they could. Is that the kind of people that we want policing the planet? Ones that are going to maybe help the bad dictators rather than the good people who are trying to create democracy and freedom? No, that worries us. The idea of turning over power over to Russia, I don't think is something the United States would want to do. All right, how about the other really big, powerful country in the world? The one whose economy is about as big as the United States, China. Couldn't they take over a bigger role in the world? Well, again, we're back to the same problem. They don't share our values, particularly about personal liberty and human rights and things like that. And if they're the ones policing the planet, then they'll be policing it according to their values instead of ours. And that worries us again. All right, how about the European Union? That's the confederation of most countries across Western Europe. The countries of Western Europe generally share values similar to the United States. We at least think that we wouldn't have to worry about them stepping all over freedom and democracy around the planet if they were in charge with policing it. But there's no way it's going to happen. The European Union simply doesn't have the money to do so. We talked before about the expenses of the entitlement state in previous lessons. Well, those expenses are even bigger in Europe because they have even more entitlement and welfare programs. And so the idea of them now suddenly spending a bunch of money on defending the rest of the world probably isn't going to happen, even if we ask them to join in and take a bigger role. They just financially aren't going to be able to do it. So how about the United Nations as a whole? Let's say it's sort of one world government to be in charge of everything. Well, that's not really a multipolar world anymore. Well, maybe it could be, but we've got one entity kind of in charge. But the bigger problem is this doesn't really fix our problem. First of all, the United Nations, oftentimes filled with a bunch of countries that are small and feel oppressed, oftentimes votes in a way that are against the interests of the United States of America. So we're not sure that we'd really want the United Nations trying to decide what's best for the world in a real sense. But even if we did, it still doesn't solve the problem of us just not wanting to be burdened by being the world's policeman. The reason is that the United Nations gets about a quarter of its budget every year from the United States of America. And that number would go up, 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 up if now they had big military responsibilities around the world. But also, when the United Nations has been engaged in big military actions, such as the war in Korea, most of the troops that they brought in to fight there were American troops. So we would end up, if we put the United Nations in charge, with perhaps the United States just as burdened as they are now, but without the control that we have now. Instead, somebody would be using our resources under their orders, rather than us using our resources under our orders. So in the end, we look at this and we just say, maybe there's no good option right now. We don't want to keep being the world's policeman, but maybe we're kind of stuck doing it. All right, that completes this lesson, and it completes our unit on public policy, Unit 11. Now let's review what we learned in this lesson. First of all, what is a unipolar world? Is it where one country dominates, where two countries dominate, where multiple countries dominate, or where no countries dominate? A unipolar world is where one country dominates the world, militarily, economically, culturally. Who is currently the world's policeman? Is it the European Union? Is it the United States? Is it the United Nations, or is it Russia? Currently, the world's policeman is the United States of America. We're kind of stuck looking out for the rest of the world to make sure that they're safe. Now, when I originally talked about this, I forgot to say, I'll just give one example. The ocean between China and Japan. There's a lot of trade that goes back and forth across there. And the Navy that's patrolling that area to keep it safe is the United States Navy. That's the kind of thing that happens where we have our troops all over the world keeping the world safe. And we're not sure we want to do it anymore. What is isolationism? Is it where we only work with some nations? Is it that we defend America first? Is it that we engage with other countries? Or is it that we leave other countries alone? Isolationism is us leaving other countries alone. What is a multipolar world? Is it where one country dominates, two countries dominate, multiple countries dominate, or no countries dominate? A multipolar world is where multiple countries dominate. All right, that completes this lesson on foreign policy within the unit on public policy. Our next lesson will be from the new unit, Unit 12. It'll be Lesson 1 about Georgia history.